clicker.
All right. All right, I think I'll just stay down here, if that's all right. So my name is Annie Schmidt, and I am currently serving as a strategic advisor for the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. I recently changed positions, and my former title was the Director of Policy and Partnerships for the Washington State Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. One of the problems for me is that I tend to wear a lot of hats, multiple times at multiple levels. I've been working in and around the fire field for probably 20 years now, at everything ranging from the local level to the state level to the federal level, for agencies and NGOs. It has the byproduct of making my list of affiliations long and my experience broad, but in many ways I'm a jack of all trades and master of none. I think it's important to frame this discussion in the context of the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. Yesterday, we heard from a variety of speakers about the impacts of wildland fire. You saw the human health impacts. We saw a lot of images and stories about mental health impacts, the types of community populations that were likely to be impacted. And it's hard to juxtapose that narrative and those images with the vision of how this nation can and should live with wildland fire, right? To safely and effectively extinguish fire where needed, use fire when allowable, manage our natural resources, and as a nation, to live with wildland fire. Recovery in this context can be challenging, but it gives us tremendous opportunities. It makes us walk the talk in some very real ways, because it confronts us with intense and fairly substantial and long-lived community needs. I'm not quite sure what's happening there. But actually, it works out okay, because we're going to be talking about North Central Washington, and that's above the black line that you see on your screen. So it works fine. See? North Central Washington. It's going to be fine. We're mostly covered. So, you know, the history of fire in Washington, which is where my work has largely focused, is important to consider for context. So this map would have looked really differently in 2013. In 2014, we experienced Washington State's most substantial wildland fire season. Fires burned 425,000 acres in 2014. So that was bad. It cost nearly $182 million to suppress. We had significant structure damage from, in our perspective, by California standards. It's probably less so. And that was rough. Do we have a laser pointer? Okay, so this fire here, the one with the donut in the middle, is the Carlton Complex. And it was the most publicized fire in 2014. Heavily impacted the town of Pateros, Washington. That community is about 600 residents, and 111 structures were lost in the surrounding area. So percentage-wise, we see a significant impact in that place. So 2014, it was bad. But 2015, less than 18 months later, it was worse. Washington State burned over 1 million acres in 2015. And in a great uncomfortable scenario, these three fires here, I call them the triplets, but they actually have individual names. This one, and this one, in addition to this one, burning into the Carlton Complex area, those were fires of 2015. There were social media posts during that time that showed the map of Washington State, much like this one, entirely obscured by smoke, saying if you're having trouble figuring out where the fires are, we can tell you it's everywhere. And for reference, Mordor is in the lower corner. Those were the types of community attempts to deal with the fact that we felt under siege largely. But this map also shows what we didn't have to recover from, and I think that's a point worth making. All of these little black dots that you can see on those maps, those are fires that were caught by initial attack at less than 10 acres. If you're looking at the national statistics in a paper by Carlton and Jack Cohen in 2014, they indicated that 97% or so of our fires are caught on initial attack. We win way more than most of the time. That's an admirable statistic. The problem is that the 3% highlighted by Carlton in that paper of fires that get away cause 97% of the damage. So we are forced to recover from the fires that get away from us on our worst days. Yay, so this is the zoom in. This is Washington State's large fire history from 1973 to 2018. You can see the Carlton Complex fire, oh, nope, here that I mentioned, and then these three here from 2015. This is Okanagan Complex here, Chelan Complex burned in that time. We have a strong and robust fire history. So that gives us lots of opportunities to recover. It also gives us lots of opportunities to prepare for wildland fire and lots of opportunities to, as the vision of the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Strategy suggests, live with fire. So that looks like a lot of blue, and that's only from 1973 to 2018. But I think it's also worth pointing out that Ryan Haugo in a recently published paper indicates that we have an order of magnitude less fire on this landscape than we have had historically. Fire management practices, that same percentage I showed you on the slide before, all the little black dots that don't grow larger than 10 acres, have dramatically shaped the fire adaptation of our landscape and the human position on it. So that's a lot of context. What does it mean for recovery? So, Headwaters Economics published a report. There are some pluses and minuses attached with this report in 2018. It's analysis of 5 case studies led to the representation of the full, and I'm going to use that term as they used it, community costs of wildland fire. It is less robust on the public health impacts than the NIST study, and if you're interested in that, I can talk about that. But what it does, that for our purposes, it's adequate. It highlights that the costs we tend to hear about, the suppression costs, are 9%. 9% of the costs of wildland fire. And all of the rest of it is not a suppression cost. In fact, 65% of that cost is the long tail of recovery that David talked about in his introduction. 65% is not a short-term impact. And who bears that cost? Let's talk about the state and local communities. The community of Pateros that I mentioned earlier, 600 residents in a county that is smaller than most of the communities here, right? Not geographically, you know, but we do not have a dense population in north central Washington. It's one of the reasons that most of us choose to live there, and it's one of the reasons that can make recovery in this type of environment particularly difficult. As you can see from this slide, the local folks have to stand up when our assistance stands down. Okay, incident management teams leave. If you're lucky, you get a burned area emergency response team, commonly called a BEAR team, that will come in and talk to you about post-fire flood hazards. If you're lucky. Not always do you get that assistance. And then if there is a federal disaster declaration, that triggers some additional assistance that our previous speaker, Byron, talked about. Okay, but the point that I think is important here is to note that in a community of 600, when your tax base is impacted, when your water system is impacted, like we heard about yesterday, your community service organizations. I thought when Genevieve said, we are not an emergency response organization, but we were called to be one, that mirrors our experience in Washington State very well, right? You have organizations that are providing social support, social services, wildfire preparedness services, conservation districts, community foundations that are standing up in the immediate aftermath of these disasters, often because that's what they're called to do without the resources that they would need to do those jobs effectively. They do them not because it's a line item in their budget, but because there's simply nothing else to be done. You talk to the Community Action Council in Okanagan, and they make the point that, you know, if they'd known how long that tail of recovery would have been, they don't know that they would have made the same choices. They feel like they had to make the same choices, but that it was incredibly taxing for their human capacity in that situation. So I want to talk a little bit about specifics. So when I first returned to North Central Washington after a fair bit of time away, I worked for the Chumstick Wildfire Stewardship Coalition in North Central Washington. And this organization is a small community-based organization dedicated to the tenets of the cohesive strategy, helping communities live with wildland fire. The other dots you see on this map represent other members of the Washington State Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. Many of these places existed in 2014, but not all. The places were there. The organizations they represent didn't necessarily exist. The Chumstick Coalition developed an After the Fire toolkit. I led the development of this product. And it was designed, it was our first foray, really, into anything that came after preparedness or suppression. This document talks about risks to communities post-fire. And we identified that in many of these rural places, the capacity simply doesn't exist to communicate these hazards to their community. So what folks were doing was either not talking about them at all because they weren't aware of the risk, or they were struggling to get the communication out in time. We developed a toolkit that could be customized, printed from any computer with a PDF. You didn't even have to have a color printer. There are PSAs, there are social media posts, door hangers, etc. So when we did this in 2013. When 2014 happened, it was the first call I made. I made 2 calls. One was to the Okanagan Conservation District to say, I have a resource that you can use. The next call was to the Community Foundation of North Central Washington to thank them for standing up as a host for funding that was going to come in and fund the Unmet Needs Roundtable, which met weekly from 2014 until last October, when they finally decreased the frequency to monthly. That community roundtable funded the gaps in the federal programs we just heard mentioned in the previous discussion, buying things that other programs couldn't cover to make sure that hearing aids and microscopes that were lost in the fire were covered. So that established a linkage there. We then started getting information from the Okanagan County Long-Term Recovery Organization, and that linkage was established with the Okanagan Conservation District, also with the Chumstick Coalition, and we shared that in 2015 when the Sleepy Hollow fire damaged 30 homes in Wenatchee and took 3 commercial warehouses via ember throw 1.5 miles, which I know we're going to talk about in the preparedness section. This essentially started to form the basis of the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. And if you're interested in social network analysis, Max Pincus from Portland State University has recently done a pretty robust analysis of these connections in North Central Washington. So what does this mean for recovery? We had been thinking, the Chumstick Coalition, as you saw, our first concept that recovery was more robust than we had thought it was, came from post-fire debris flows. Our depictions, and this comes from the National Response Framework, show preparedness as, and to their credit, they say ongoing, but you can see the bar stops at the disaster. I think the graphic representation is probably more accurate than we'd like it to be. And then we show this long tail of recovery, short-term, intermediate, and long-term, taking months and years. We're still recovering in north central Washington, right? So we thought, well, that's not real accurate. So we're going to work with the Washington State Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network, and we're going to develop a cyclical model of this. And it's going to be better because communities like Okanagan is now starting to turn the corner from recovery and talking more and more about preparedness and community preparedness 4 years later. And it is better, but it's not enough. It's not accurate. And the reason is because communities, individual communities, are rarely all in the same place at the same time. Paradise is a little different this way. They had such substantial loss that many of those, I mean 95%, right, loss, that's a substantial number. But in areas even like Pateros, we didn't even approach that. In Wenatchee and the Sleepy Hollow fire, we had 30 homes lost. And so what we heard repeatedly was from survivors groups saying, you can't continue to talk about preparation the way you're talking about it. Every time you do, it makes us feel as though you're blaming us, victim blaming and shaming for our loss. So all of a sudden, the light bulb went on, and we thought, okay, not only can communities and should communities be in multiple phases of this cycle at once, you know, we're always preparing, that's great. Some people are going to be recovering, and some people are still preparing, and we have to come up with ways to talk to our communities that meet the entire community where they are, not just one sector. Recovery can come in, and it happens where it takes over a lot of your work, but you still have a segment of the population that's not recovering, or maybe that's recovering from the fire before, or the fire that comes 18 months later, 13 months later in our case. So the take-homes that I want to leave you with. They're going to be good, so I made you wait. It's really important that when you're working in communities that are experiencing recovery, that we do no harm. And I know that that's something that probably resonates with this crowd, but that's the standard that we apply as we're preparing our communities as well. I can't tell you the number of, well, I'll tell you one time I took an after the fire toolkit material to Sleepy Hollow and presented it to that community. And well, I had it with me. I was ready to go. And fortunately, there was another speaker in front of me who experienced a fair amount of questions about how that material was making them feel. And so we adjusted pretty quickly, right? That's not the message there. But to present that, to present how you harden your home in the context of recovery warrants some thought. And it's incredibly important work, and we're gonna talk about it in a panel later this afternoon. But in the context of recovery, we must be careful. We should do no harm. The second is a mantra that Okanagan Community Long-Term Recovery used repeatedly, and what does this person need to recover from this disaster in this community, meeting each individual person where they are with the assistance of volunteer organizations. We must seize the opportunities for cross-sector leadership, honor communities as knowledge holders, and empower their recovery, not treat it. And the last thing is that we have to take care of our own. And this was a motto that we held fast to in Washington State while the state was on fire. And that was, you should reach or throw when someone is drowning, not jump in and drown too. Reach or throw, don't go. So those are the key lessons that I think we experienced in Washington State. And thank you for your time.
Megan Kurtz.